So just another quick reminder that next week we're going to be starting our reading of Voltaire's Candide. So make sure that you're bringing that to class with you next time. You're going to read the first 31 pages, which is the first 13 chapters. Right? So what that tells us, right, the chapters in this are really, really short. Right? So I'll give you some guide questions at the end of class. The one thing that I do want you to do, though, is select a quote from within these 31 pages about which you think you can do a free write on Tuesday, right? So, use the same kind of principles we've been using in class. Or, look for, a quote that you think heavily implies or suggests something that it doesn't clearly state, right? Pick apart connotations of language. Look for binary oppositions, patterns of repetition and similarity, right? All the kinds of things that we've been doing with stuff in class so far. And what we're going to be doing a free write over each reading assignment over the next couple weeks, right? And the idea here is to help you generate ideas, generate material for the paper that you're going to be writing, right? I just gave you the directions for the paper. We'll look over those in a minute. But I do also quickly want to show you that if you go into Georgia View, and you click on the shell for this class, and now we wait for the damn thing to wake up. So you can see here, right, that I've got a folder here for Candide. So if you click on that folder, you'll find a couple of resources here that'll help you understand some of what's going on in Candide, right? So it would probably be a good idea to read this article on the problem of evil over the weekend as you're reading Candide, and also to listen to this BBC radio podcast, which will tell you a little. It's an interview with a couple of scholars who study French literature, who study Voltaire specifically, and it'll help you get a sense of what is going on in this book, right, and what to do with it, and what kinds of ideas people generate about it. Okay? So any questions about anything so far? All right, so then let's talk through quickly the assignment sheet I just gave you for paper. Which, right, if you look at the due dates down at the bottom of the sheet, you've got plenty of time here, right? So it's no need to freak out about this yet. All right, so what you're going to be doing for your first major paper assignment is making an original argument about the importance of some specific pattern of language or imagery in either Voltaire's Candide or Rousseau's Social Contract. So we're going to do this assignment in 3 stages. There's going to be peer review, there's going to be a draft, there's going to be a finished paper. And I've outlined here the various principles we've been talking about in class that you need to keep in mind as you're writing, right? So first, your thesis has to be arguable in the 3 senses that we discussed. You want to develop your thesis by looking for meaningful figures of speech, seeking out patterns of repetition and similarity and thinking about what they imply, paying attention to ambiguity in language, right? So the connotations of words, those associated ideas, in addition to literal meanings, as well as alternate meanings for certain words, right? and also try to locate and examine any like binary oppositions you see, right? So what kinds of ideas do we see held in contrast here? Remember to examine your data closely before you come up with a thesis, right? So that whole negative capability thing, right? Let yourself sit with the material first before you try to determine what it means. Remember, this seems to be about X, but it's really about Y formulation as you're trying to come up with your thesis. Connect each of your claims to the evidence you're using to make that claim by explaining your warrant. And remember structurally here that each paragraph should start with a claim that you're testing against a piece of evidence, right? And that this claim is expected to evolve over the course of the paper. So does anybody have any questions so far about this? Everything seemed relatively clear. Again, it all follows from what we've been doing. And we'll continue practicing today with thesis statements and that sort of thing, right? We'll talk a little bit today as well about introductions and conclusions and what to do with those. I do also want to note two things, right? One, don't be afraid to ask me for help, right? If you get stuck and you want a little bit of assistance at any stage in the paper, right, come talk to me. Now, I know that both of you are a little bit on the quieter side, right? So you might be a little bit shy about asking for help, right? Please don't be, right? Don't feel like you're bothering me. Don't feel like it's an imposition or anything like that, right? I'm happy to help, and it's always better if you don't know what to do, right, to ask for help than to simply do nothing. So please, if you get stuck, come ask me for help. The other thing I want to remind you of is that I do give extra credit if you go to the Writing Center, right? So if you take if you go to the Writing Center, take the assignment sheet with you, explain to them what you're doing, and they'll help you at any stage of the assignment you're at, right? Whether you're just trying to generate ideas or whether you actually have a draft for them to look at, right? And I will give you half a letter grade's improvement on the assignments if you go to the Writing Center, right? So if the assignment would otherwise say earn a C+, you'll get a B-, right? Okay. So the draft is going to be due Thursday, the 29th of September. It's going to have to be at least 750 words to receive full credit. And provided I get a complete draft from you that is not plagiarized, I will give you full credit for the draft, right? As long as I get 750 or more words that are your own words and that are making a reasonable stab at the assignment, right, I will give you full points for it. The paper, I will grade qualitatively, right? You're going to bring your draft to class for peer review on Tuesday the 4th. I will have looked at your paper before then, so you'll have had another chance to revise it before you bring it to class for peer review. And then the final paper is going to be due on Thursday the 6th of October. And it has to be 1,000 to 1,500 words long. So, if we're talking double-spaced, 12-point font pages, it's about 4 or 5 pages, right? So, what was I going to say? You got about a month to complete this, right? So it's probably best to start thinking about it as we start reading Voltaire, right? Start looking for stuff you think you might be able to write a paper about, right? Keep this assignment in mind as we're reading these two books over the next few weeks. Do either of you have any questions about due dates, about what's expected, about what you're supposed to do? Yes, there is a side 2 here. So let's also just kind of quickly go over the grading standards so you all know what I'm looking for here. So think of these as being kind of like a pyramid, right? Where, you know, the qualities that make for a B, C, or D paper are implied in what makes an A paper, right? So the bare minimum, right, to get a D on this paper, it means that it meets the basic formal requirements, right? It's long enough, it's properly formatted, and you cited your sources, right? That's enough to not get an F. In order to get a C, right, in order to get a genuinely passing grade, it has to deal with the actual issue the assignment's asking you to think about, right? So you're giving me an actual interpretation of Voltaire or Rousseau. It has to demonstrate that you understood what you were reading. Your sources have to be properly cited, and you have to advance a clear thesis. In order to get a B, you have to do all of those things, plus give me a clear, consistent, effectively arranged argument. You have to make sure you're quoting your primary source directly, right? And I can't stress this enough, right? So I think that some of this comes from high school and some of this comes from norms in other disciplines, right? But in the humanities, the norm is that you quote directly the sources that you're talking about, right? Don't summarize or paraphrase them. Give me a quote and tell me what you think it means, right? Since so much of what we do in an English class is based on interpretation of text and interpretation of language, right? I need to see the actual language that you're getting your ideas from. And you need to explain to me how you're drawing your ideas from this specific language, right? So it is important that you quote directly. A B paper also does not treat opinion as facts, right? So it shows that you understand the distinction between claim and evidence, right? And you make clear and effective transitions between paragraphs. Now for an A paper, right, you're giving me an argument that's original and nuanced, right, that acknowledges complexity and acknowledges other possible viewpoints. You're dealing effectively with evidence that might contradict or complicate your argument. You're giving me a good balance between argument and evidence. You're contextualizing your argument properly and avoiding glaring historical mistakes. And you're following a single line of argument to its conclusion without any digressions, right? So you're not taking any weird little side paths, right? Everything in the paper leads to the development of a single thesis, right? So, is all of this clear to both of you? Do either of you have any questions at all? And I'll give you a minute to look over the assignment, to look over the grading standards, and think about whether there's anything here that is unclear. Because I do just want to make sure everybody understands what we're doing before we proceed.
We have read the whole book by the time the draft is due.
Oh, yes, yes. You will have read both by the time the draft is due. And we'll be starting by that point in on like the direct material on the French Revolution for the reacting to the past game. But the stuff that you're reading now is going to provide philosophical backing for the stuff we're going to be doing later in the semester with the reacting session. So this stuff is to help you to understand the ideas that the French Revolution rose out of.
So we just supposed to pick a thesis as arguable? between the two groups?
Yeah, you're only going to write about one of the books, right? You're going to write about Voltaire or you're going to write about Rousseau. And that's going to be up to you. That's going to be your choice. Yeah, you're not going to be comparing the two. If there's anything I've got here that y'all want to go back over or that you want me to discuss in more detail, let me know. So Morgan, you look like you're set. You're good. Jennifer, are you good, or do you have a question? Okay, great. All right. So then let's go back to talking about thesis statements. Then I want to return to the exercise you were doing at the end of class last time, and then we'll talk about introductions and conclusions to wrap up, and I'll give you the guide questions for Voltaire. Okay. So. What does a strong thesis statement look like? Do you remember from last time? What does a strong thesis statement need?
Oh. 3 points.
Okay, yeah, I gave you all 3 points. Each of them had little sub-points too, but we can just kind of go with the major ones, right?
Has to be arguable.
Yes, has to be arguable. And this is the biggest and most important one, right? Your thesis statement has to make a claim, right? It has to go out on some kind of limb and say, this is what I think is happening here, right? And this is why it's important. What else do we need with a thesis statement? What else does it need to be? It has to be narrow. Yeah, it has to be focused on something specific. Good. And what was the third point? Productive. Yes, it has to give you a roadmap for development of the rest of the paper, right? So I want to start by talking about certain common problems with thesis statements and how we might get around them, how we might fix them, right? So if we turn to page 208 in Writing Analytically, we have a list of weak thesis statement types along with examples. So this is something you should keep by your side as you are trying to develop a thesis and something you should test against, right? But let's kind of try a couple of examples here and see if you can recognize the problems with them. So if I write something like, this paper will discuss the theme of optimism in Candide. Is this or is this not a good thesis? Good. It is not a good thesis. You're right. Why is it not a good thesis? What doesn't it do?
Leave room for imagination. We already know what they're talking about.
Okay, well, you don't want to leave too much room for imagination, right? Because you actually do want your reader to know what you're trying to argue, right? But you're right that this is not a good thesis. Any other theories as to why this, why this isn't a good thesis? Any other ideas as to why this isn't a good thesis? What is it missing? What does it not do? What's the biggest, first, most... Yeah, exactly. There's no claim here, right? You're just saying, I'm going to talk about this theme in Candide, right? But you're not telling your reader what you're going to say about it. You're not making any argument about the theme of optimism in Candide. You're just saying, this is what I'm going to talk about, right? So yeah, this has no claim. And this is one of the most... We go over this first because it's one of the most common types of thesis statements. And I think it's often one of the hardest when you're writing to recognize you're doing, right? You think, well, I said what I was going to talk about, right? I mean, that means I've got a thesis. But remember that the thesis always has to be making a claim. So how would we fix something like this? What would we do with it? How would we make this into a viable thesis?
You put the theme of optimism in Candide at the beginning. I don't know what this paper, book class. I can see it.
Okay. Well, if what this is missing, right, is a claim, right, then what we need to do is make a claim about this, right? We've got to actually say something about the theme of optimism in Candide that is arguable, right? So, say, we think this through, and how does the theme of optimism in Candide work? Well, we can come up with something like, and I realize you wouldn't come up with something like this because you haven't read the book yet, right? Right. While Voltaire is critical of constant, mindless optimism, in Candide. And that, by the way, is one thing that I do want y'all to be aware of as you're reading, right? As Americans, we're hardwired to think that optimism is a good thing. Voltaire thinks it's dumb. And so one of the things you're going to want to think about is why he thinks optimism is dumb, right? So while Voltaire is critical of constant, mindless optimism in Candide, pessimism is considered, he portrays pessimism as equally useless. So this might still need a little bit of work, right? But at least I'm making a claim now about the way the novel treats this particular idea, right? Does this make sense? Okay, so let's try another one here, kind of along similar lines. And one way you can often recognize some types of problematic thesis is by their shape, right? So let's say something like, the music of Kiss, inspired by your t-shirt here, is based on volume, energy, and raunchy lyrics, right? So I'm still not making a claim here, really, right? I'm just describing three elements in the music of this particular band. But what shape does this thesis have? What am I doing at the end of it? What am I making at the end of it?
Claim.
Is this a claim, really? It's purely descriptive, right? I'm just describing these three elements in their music, right? What I've got here is a list. And you want to make sure that your thesis never looks like this, right? Now, there's a particular reason why a lot of no-claim theses actually look like a list. Were either of you taught the 5-paragraph form in school? Wow.
Introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and physical solution.
Yes, exactly.
Oh,
right?
man.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you were taught to write that way in high school, right? Okay, and like in general, that particular mode of writing is not going to serve you well in college, because while it teaches you how to organize a paper, it doesn't really teach you how to make an argument, right? In this paper, I am going to talk about these three things. Here's one paragraph on one thing, a second paragraph on the second thing, and a third paragraph on the third thing, right? And then, yep, in the conclusion, I state, see, I proved my point. Mostly by repeating the introduction, right? So, that 5-paragraph form is static, right? It doesn't move an idea forward. It only works for really kind of simple stuff that's easy to prove right or wrong. And if you have this list in your thesis, then you're falling into that 5-paragraph hole. So what you want to do, if you find yourself writing this kind of list-like thesis, there's going to be some reason why you chose the three things in your list, right? So you're going to want to ask yourself, what do these things have in common? Right? Think about your own responses here and why you chose these three things, right? Like what your logic is for linking them in your brain. And whatever these things have in common, that's the thing that you are actually trying to make a claim about, right? So, if I'm looking at this, okay, so this is loud, energetic music with raunchy lyrics, right? What do these things have in common, really, when I think about a Kiss? Okay, so a lot of it is about kind of like you're putting the thumb in the eye of stuck-up authority figures and annoying older people, right? So, or at least when Kiss's records came out in the early 70s, that's what they've been about. Youth have new ways to annoy older people, right? You're always inventing new ways to annoy us. But, so, that would be the thing I would make my claim about, right? That the music of Kiss, was designed to appeal to youth by offending the sensibilities of older people. That's something that would be a little bit more arguable, right? Okay. Damn it. Okay, you did not fall. Good. Nearly broken that thing so many times. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So what about this? If I say, while the women's suffrage movement, that is, right, the move, suffrage here is not suffering, right? Suffrage is the right to vote, right? While the women's suffrage movement faced many obstacles, in the early 20th century, they eventually succeeded in getting women the right to vote. Now, if we think about the shape of a thesis statement that we talked about last time, right, the whole seems to be about X is really about Y thing, how does this look? We've got a subordinate clause and an independent clause, right? We've got two ideas reacting to each other. But what's wrong with this thesis? Yeah, this is a statement of fact, right? It's this is a specific...
It's like evidence.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, there's no claim here. I could look this up, right? Yeah, so this is a specific category of no claim thesis, right? This is just a statement of fact.
Okay, can you do one that's correct and explain how to do, because the homework, I know how to pick out the subordinate infant. I just don't know how to what you say, like compare the two. You said how they relate to each other.
Okay,
Because
sure.
when I do that, I don't know. It's just not right.
Okay, so let's actually, so we can kind of work on, I think, how to get this one right? So what we can do with this is interrogate the facts a little bit, right? Dig a little deeper into them and see if they really tell the whole story, right? If there's something about the facts that we can make an argument about, right? So when the women's suffrage movement got women the right to vote in the early 20th century, did they get all American women the right to vote? Yeah. Suffrage was limited to white women, right? So here we can actually raise a question about this, right? So we can rephrase this as something like, if we dig into the facts and think about why this is, right, we have to answer some kind of how or why question here, right? While the women's suffrage movement earned white women the right to vote, it did so by ignoring and disassociating from organizations that fought for African American civil rights. Right, and this is something, like, again, like, I'm not taking a position on whether or not this is what actually happened or whatever, right? But this is an arguable point, right? I've questioned these simple historical facts, found something in it that looks odd, right? By digging into the details, and then come up with a viable argument here, right? Something I could make a claim about. And this follows the same structure, right? So we've got our subordinate clause, which is, okay, here's, women's rights movement success, right? And but I'm pushing back against that idea with the actual claim that I'm making, right? That their success was at the expense of, and by kind of like literally dissociating themselves from, civil rights movements, right? Like African American civil rights groups, right? So this is how you would take one of these no-claim statement of facts theses and turn it into something that is an argument or that makes a claim. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Still having a little bit of trouble with this?
Kind of, but it's still there.
Okay. So where are you still getting? Let's work on where you're still getting hung up. Like, is it the connection between the two
Yes.
that you're having trouble with? Okay. So let's just remind ourselves of, this seems to be about X. Is really about Y formula here, right? So the Y that we're coming up with, this is the interpretation that we want, is built out of that X, right? That kind of common interpretation. Think about it as like trying to revise some kind of commonly held idea, right? This is what I think other people think, or how I think other people will read this. But this is what I think is really going on. Right? So think of it as you're kind of like pointing out something that you think the common, ordinary, everyday reading misses. So if we think only about the successes of the women's suffrage movement, we tend to ignore the things that maybe they didn't get right or that they didn't achieve, right? And so I'm going to focus on this other thing that people don't talk about as much. Does this make sense? Okay. And again, we'll keep working on this, right? We'll keep practicing with this. Okay. Let's go back to our example from last time. And come up with something about Titanic, right? The fact that after all these years, Rose still remembers Jack, proves that love conquers all. What's wrong with this? Okay, although you don't really, you're not really going to have evidence in your thesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, your thesis is kind of like your kind of broad interpretation of the evidence you're looking at, right? This is the common pattern I see running through all of this. Is there anything in this thesis statement that sounds familiar, like a phrase you feel like you've heard before?
Little crocodile.
Yeah. Does anybody know what we call these phrases that get repeated all the time as though they're deep and profound, but they don't really mean anything?
Oh, you said this. Like when you take it too little.
Conventional wisdom.
Yeah, or a cliche, right? This is a cliche. And cliches are these little formulas, right? They're conventional wisdom that we tend to substitute for having an actual original thought, right? So what you want to do when you recognize in your own writing that you're using these kinds of familiar phrases is, right, think about, it's like, well, wait, like, does this actually apply here? I mean, Rose still remembers Jack when she's an old lady, and, he is, bones at the bottom of the ocean, right? Poor bastard. But does that really prove that love conquers all? Like, if this does demonstrate any kind of argument about love, right? It shows, that love is at least on some level kind of contingent and situational. She didn't love him enough to move over on that door. So when you find yourself writing a cliche in your thesis statement, like love conquers all, or family is everything, or one of those kinds of things, right? Question the cliche, right? What's going on here that the cliche doesn't explain? And that'll help you come up with an argument. Okay, what else? Personal conviction. So, if I were to write something like, I'm trying to think of a good example, and I can't because I don't have a lot of strong personal convictions. Okay, let's go to the example in the book here, right? If we go to page 210, the problem example here says, Sir Thomas More's utopia proposes an unworkable set of solutions to society's problems because, like communist Russia, it suppresses individualism. So this is making a claim, right? But it's a claim that's based on this particular writer's personal preference for individualism and distaste for any kind of collectivist political system, right? So try to avoid making arguments that are based on your personal feelings or your personal convictions, religious, political, or otherwise, when you're making arguments just about a text, right? Just, try to avoid that this is what I think is good and should be, right? Or this is what I think is bad and should not be kind of response. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why a lot of your instructors probably didn't want you to use the word I much in your formal writing. Have you ever heard this rule before? Yeah, that you're never supposed to use I in a formal paper. And that's not true, right? You can absolutely use the word I in a formal academic paper, right? Professional academics do that shit all the time. But I think that, like, by making it a hard and fast rule, I think what a lot of teachers forget about this is the purpose of it, right? We don't want you using I too much because we want you to maintain some level of objectivity, right? We don't want you to over-personalize your argument and make it about feelings or personal convictions rather than kind of like, logical consideration of evidence. So, yeah, remember to be objective and not to write from personal conviction in a formal academic paper, right? Certain kinds of expressive writing you might do will absolutely allow you to, write about, your personal feelings or beliefs or convictions, right? But in general, in academic writing, remember that everything you write needs to be supported by evidence. And by their very nature, you can't support feelings and beliefs with evidence, right? Okay. So that should cover the most problematic thesis types that you're going to tend to encounter, or that you may end up writing as you're drafting. Does anybody have questions about these? Okay, so what I want you to do is return to the exercise we were doing at the end of class last time, right? Look over what you've got. Make sure you're not falling into any of these particular weak thesis types. And just take a few minutes, keep working with it, and see if you can further develop the thesis ideas you came up with, right? See if you can try to evolve them by applying more pieces of evidence. So this is this sheet with the facts about housing and city planning that we were working with, right? So yeah, just take 10 minutes and see what you can do.
You have to write another thesis?
You don't necessarily need to write another one, but I want you to try to keep evolving the one that you came up with last time, right? And I want you, again, to make sure that any thesis you're coming up with doesn't fall into one of these weak thesis types. take 2 more minutes. Just see how far you can get with this evidence. Okay, so who wants to talk through what they got? Well, let me put it this way. Who wants to talk through what they got first?
I do.
Okay, go ahead, Morgan. So what did you start with?
First, I started with, although this could be about development of towns and neighborhoods after the 1950s, it's actually about how suburban areas like to bring less attention as possible to the neighborhood.
Okay, good. And what pieces of evidence did you use to get that?
For the first part about the development of towns and neighborhoods of the 1950s,
Okay.
I used the first thing that was on the page, about 80% of everything built in America was built after 1945.
Okay, good.
I used American homes built before 1950 rarely had attached garage carport. American neighborhoods developed after 1950 rarely have sidewalks.
Okay.
And then in the average American home, the garage is as large as living space.
Okay, cool. Okay, so where did you take that? Like, what new evidence did you apply, and what thesis did you come up with? How did you end up revising that thesis?
Okay, I kept reading because my ending part didn't sound too good.
Okay.
So I kept the beginning, and then the end I put basically it's about the evolution of cars and transportation in suburban neighborhoods.
Okay. So what this is really about is less about it's less about suburban development. It's more about the importance of cars in the development of that. Okay. And what did you add to, or what pieces of evidence did you test against to get that?
On the back.
Okay.
I put people in suburban neighborhoods after opposed to new housing units, school, hospitals, that. Urban neighborhoods and traditional downtown usually include mixed commercial buildings. I use that one.
Okay.
It's several of America's most popular tourist destinations, including parks at Disney. It's on the front. Suburban neighborhoods rarely offer public transportation.
Okay. All right. And what did you?
Oh, and the one by cul-de-sac.
Okay. And what did you end up with? What was your final version? Was that what you, or was what you gave me the final version?
I gave you the final version when I added the evolution.
Okay.
I took out the other.
Okay. Okay. So you figured that, like, on the whole, the most important thing here was about the evolution of cars and how that shaped our neighborhoods. Okay. The car being the most important element in the way we live and design now. All right. Cool. Jennifer, what did you come up with?
For my thesis, I put the evidence provided could be about the evolution of homes in America, but it is really about the way cars have changed America's population of everything.
Okay. Was that your starting thesis, or is that where you ended up?
I ended up with this.
Okay. What did you start with? Let's just kind of walk through your process.
I mean, not too bad. So first, I was reading through it, and I found like a lot of points that pointed to how in the early 20th century, it was talking about how they rarely had attached garages or carports or sidewalks, and then now in the average home, the garage is larger than the living space. So that's where I got how the evolution of homes in America has evolved.
Okay.
And then for my second part, which is what is all about parents and being all about. It had a lot of points of how like people in suburban neighborhoods often oppose the building of new housing units, schools, hospitals, or retail centers near their homes because they know if there's going to be more buildings, there's going to be more traffic.
More damn cars,
yeah, more cars. And then Americans can drive to where to spend roughly 2.5 weeks per year sitting in traffic, which is the population increasing because of cars and new buildings.
Yeah, and new buildings not being close to each other, so people could walk between them, right? Okay, so yeah, so I think I think you both got the right idea here, right? Is that I think you both had ideas that you were able to evolve in a couple of different versions here, right? From an original notion by looking at the evidence in a broader spectrum, right? So I think you started, for example, Jennifer, talking mostly about homes, and then kind of broadening that out to neighborhoods and other infrastructure, right? So yeah, and this is what we're gonna keep. We're gonna keep doing this stuff with Voltaire and with Rousseau, right? Just kind of trying to come up with arguments based on our readings and applying pieces of evidence to see if, say by the end of the class we still think what we thought at the beginning of class. But before we cut it today and I give you the reading questions for the Voltaire, I do want to talk a little bit about introductions and conclusions, because I know that these are particular trouble spots when people are writing. And we can continue this conversation later if we have to, but just to give you a quick and dirty overview of what introductions and conclusions are supposed to do, what they're supposed to look like, right? So what's the purpose of an introduction? What's that? Okay. You want to catch the reader's attention, but is that all you want to do, right? You could catch the reader's attention by just writing like "hey" in big bold letters and giving a bunch of exclamation points.
Give like an overview of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Do you want to give the whole story in the introduction? Yeah, you want to give the reader enough to get them interested and enough to understand the framework of the argument, right? But you don't want to give the whole game away right in the first paragraph. So the big thing that you're trying to do in your introduction is set up an interpretive context. for your thesis, right? And by interpretive context, what we mean is the lens through which you're looking at your subject. And there are any number of different kinds of lenses you could try on here as you're trying to come up with a thesis, right? You could be looking at something from a historical perspective. You could be looking at something from the perspective of, say you're talking about a film or a novel. You could be looking at it in terms of its narrative structure, right? The way the parts of the story fit together. You could be giving me a kind of, a linguistic analysis, right? But yeah, what you want to do in your introduction is set up what kind of lens you're looking at, or you're looking through for your reader, and explain kind of how it gets you to the thesis that you come up with, right? So I'll give you an example about Titanic, and then maybe we'll come back and talk a little bit about conclusions at the beginning of next class. So here is an introduction that I wrote based on our discussion last time, right? I got to thinking about Titanic and thinking about, the plot of the movie, the way it's put together, and I kind of remembered that what we've got at the beginning of the movie, right, is essentially like this crew that's salvaging pieces of the ship from the ocean floor, right? So they're trying to preserve historical memory by salvaging the ship. And they're also interviewing this old lady they track down who's a survivor of the wreck, right? So while there's clearly a relationship here between preservation of between historical preservation and remembrance, right? And then I got to thinking and said, well, so what that the memory they're preserving is the memory of this, this old lady who was, a young rich girl when she was making the crossing, right? So this is the introduction I came up with. James Cameron's Titanic opens with a salvage crew trying to preserve the wreckage of a ship that sank in 1912. Through their work, they get in touch with living survivors of the wreck and interview an elderly woman named Rose who gives them an account of her romance with a penniless boy. While this pairing of wealthy woman and poor boy appears to suggest that class barriers were were suspended on the ship. The fact that we are only getting Rose's memories Jack being unavailable for obvious reasons, shows that the perspectives of the wealthy will be the frame through which the viewer will experience the plot of the movie. So what I've done here, right, is I've got, my framing here, right? So, okay, so this is, I'm setting up a particular scene from the film and how this particular plot device, right, this particular plot structure reflects what the movie seems to think it's trying to do and what I think it's actually doing. So we're about out of time, so we'll go into more of this next time. We'll finish this up next time as we start talking about Candide. But this is the basic kind of form you're going to try to imitate. All right, so let me give you the reading questions for Candide. You can take these down. Please do write them down, don't photograph them. And we'll see you on Tuesday. Tuesday, yes. Right, but this class still meets twice next week.